If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1. The Golden Cage, Birth of a Destined Prince, Part 1. A Kingdom on the Edge of the World, the Shakya Republic, Queen Maya's Dream, and the Birth at Lumbini Grove. Around 563 BCE, tucked beneath the great shadow of the Himalayas, there existed a small but proud republic called the Shakya clan state. It was not a vast empire stretching across continents. It was more like a tight-knit community of warrior aristocrats who governed themselves with strict rules, deep pride, and a strong sense of who they were. Their capital, Kapilavastu, was a city of order and ceremony, a place where rank mattered, rituals were observed, and ambition quietly hummed beneath every conversation. King Suddhodana sat at the center of all this. He was not a tyrant or a conqueror. He was a practical man, a ruler who understood power and wanted to protect what he had built. His chief queen, Maya, was respected and beloved. Together they were the heart of a court that believed deeply in signs, omens, and the wisdom of the gods. Then came the dream. One night, Queen Maya saw in her sleep a great white elephant carrying a white lotus flower. It circled her 3 times and entered her womb. She woke with a strange peace she could not explain. The court Brahmins were summoned at once. These were the scholars and priests who spent their lives reading meaning into such things, and when they heard her dream, their verdict was clear. This was no ordinary conception. Something exceptional was coming. When Maya's time arrived, she was traveling toward her family's home as custom required. The journey paused at a beautiful garden grove called Lumbini, where flowering sal trees stood in full bloom. It was here, standing in the open air, holding the branch of a sal tree for support, that she gave birth to a son. The ancient stories say the infant did something no newborn had ever done. He stood, took 7 steps, and with each step a lotus flower bloomed beneath his foot. He looked at the world around him, and in a voice that carried far beyond his size, declared that this would be his final birth. Whether one takes these details as literal or symbolic, the message was unmistakable. This child was not simply the son of a king. He was something the world had been waiting for, though no one yet knew exactly what that meant. The boy was named Siddhartha, meaning one who has achieved his goal. He was healthy, beautiful, and already the subject of whispered wonder across the court. His mother Maya, however, would not live to raise him. She died just 7 days after giving birth, leaving the infant in the care of her sister Mahapajapati, who raised him with deep tenderness. A king's heir had arrived, but the manner of his arrival had already made one thing certain. The story of this child would not follow any ordinary path. The prophecy was coming, and with it, a choice that would split the court and change the course of history. Part 2. The Sage's Prophecy. Asita reads the infant's marks, Conqueror of the world or Renouncer of it. Days after the infant's naming ceremony, word spread through the mountain forests that something remarkable had been born in Kapilavastu. An old sage named Asita heard it and came down from his retreat to see for himself. Asita was not an ordinary visitor. He was the kind of man people crossed rivers and climbed hills to find. Kings respected him. Priests listened when he spoke. He had spent decades in deep meditation, reading the world through a different kind of eye. When he arrived at the palace and asked to see the child, Suddhodana did not refuse him. What happened next was quiet but enormous. Asita held the infant and studied him slowly, carefully. In the tradition he had trained in for his entire life, a truly great being carried signs in his body, marks that could be read like a map. These were called the Lakshanas, and tradition said a Mahapurusha, meaning a great being, carried 32 major marks and 80 smaller ones. Asita counted. He checked. Then he sat still for a long moment. He told the king that this child would become one of 2 things. Either a Chakravartin, a ruler so powerful he would bring the entire world under a single just reign, or a Samyak-Sambuddha, a fully awakened teacher who would show humanity the way out of suffering. Both destinies were extraordinary. Both were certain. There was no middle path between them. Then the old sage did something no one expected. He wept. The court fell silent. Why would a man weep over such news? Suddhodana asked him directly. Asita's answer was simple and heartbreaking. He was not crying for the child, whose future was glorious. He was crying for himself. He was too old. He would not live long enough to hear this boy's teaching. He would die before the light came on. That was what broke him. It is a small human moment buried inside a grand religious story, and it makes Asita feel very real. He had spent his whole life searching, and now the answer was here, small and breathing in his arms, and he would never get to hear it. Asita composed himself, offered his blessings, and left, but he left behind a crack running straight through the court. The prophecy had split the room into two kinds of fear. Some saw a future emperor and felt pride. Others heard the word Renouncer and felt dread. Suddhodana heard both, and he chose to act. He would do whatever it took to make sure his son became a king and not a wandering holy man. That decision, made in the hours after Asita walked back into the forest, would shape everything that followed. Part 3. Walls of Silk and Gold. King Suddhodana's desperate bargain. Pleasure palaces and the concealment of suffering. So Suddhodana made his choice. And once a king makes a choice, he builds walls around it. These were not ordinary walls. They were walls of silk, scented gardens, and endless music. Suddhodana did not lock his son in a dungeon. He locked him inside a dream. 3 palaces were built, one for the hot summer months, one for the cold winter, and one sheltered from the heavy monsoon rains. Each palace was stocked with every beautiful thing a young man could want. Fresh flowers every morning, dancers and musicians performing through the evenings, tables filled with the finest food, gardens so carefully tended that they always looked perfect, always in bloom, always alive. But the real work was not in what was added, it was in what was taken away. Old servants were quietly let go, replaced with young and healthy faces. If an animal in the palace grounds fell sick, it disappeared before the prince could notice. The gardeners were instructed to remove any plant that had begun to wither, and the word death, that small, heavy word, was forbidden inside the palace walls entirely. No one was to speak it. No one was to bring it anywhere near the prince. Suddhodana believed this with the full force of a father's love and a king's logic. If the boy never saw suffering, he would never ask where suffering comes from. And if he never asked that question, he would stay. He would grow into a warrior, a ruler, a Chakravartin, the world emperor Asita had promised was possible. The other path, the path of renunciation, required a trigger. Suddhodana intended to remove every possible trigger. In this way, the king treated life like a fire he could prevent by keeping all the wood wet. What he did not see, what perhaps no parent can ever fully see, was that the very perfection of the world he created made it strange. A garden that never wilts is not a real garden. A court where no one grows old is not a real court. For a boy growing into a sharp and thoughtful young man, the flawlessness of everything around him was not comforting. It was suspicious. Siddhartha grew up surrounded by beauty, and somewhere underneath it, he began to sense that something was missing. Not a thing he could name, not something he could point to, just a quiet feeling, growing slowly like a root, pushing through stone, that the world he was being shown was not the whole world. Suddhodana had tried to build a perfect king. What he was actually building, without knowing it, was a question that would one day need an answer. And the longer he kept the answer hidden, the more urgent that question would become. The palaces were beautiful, but Siddhartha's mind was already pressing against the walls. Part 4. Marriage, Mastery, and a Restless Mind. Yasodhara, the Tournament of Skills, and Siddhartha's Growing Unease. So Suddhodana had one more move to make. If walls and pleasures could not fully hold his son's attention, perhaps love could. The king arranged a tournament, a grand competition where Shakya princes would test themselves in archery, wrestling, horsemanship, and scholarly debate. The prize was simple: the hand of the most beautiful and accomplished princess among them, Yasodhara. It was not really a tournament, it was a trap. carefully built out of silk and ceremony. Siddhartha entered it anyway, and he was extraordinary. He bent bows that no other man in the court could even string. He wrestled opponents to the ground with a calm that unsettled even those watching. He rode horses that had thrown other riders. He answered questions that left scholars blinking. He did not win because he was desperate to win. He won because he could not help it. The gifts were simply there, waiting to be used. Yasodhara watched all of it. The two of them, it turned out, were well matched. Yasodhara was not a passive prize. She was sharp, warm, and strong in her own way. Their bond was real. This was not a political arrangement dressed up as romance. There was genuine tenderness between them, the kind that fills a room without needing to announce itself. For a while, life inside the palace must have felt almost whole. But almost is a dangerous word. Even with a wife he loved, even with music and beauty and every comfort imaginable, something in Siddhartha refused to stay still. One day he sat in the garden and watched the gardeners plow a field. The blade cut through the earth. Worms, split in two, twisted in the soil. Birds swooped down immediately, swallowing them whole. Then a hawk dropped from the sky and took one of the birds. And then another predator came for the hawk. He sat there, watching this small, quiet chain of violence playing out in his own garden, in his own paradise. And he felt something crack open inside him. It was not horror exactly, it was grief, a deep, wordless grief that had no clean cause and no clean cure. The garden had not changed. The palace had not changed. Yasodhara was inside, and she was real, and his love for her was real. But none of that could touch what he was feeling in that moment. The eating and the dying and the suffering just kept going, endlessly, beneath all the beauty, beneath all the silk and gold, whether anyone looked at it or not. This was the thing Suddhodana's palaces could never actually fix. They could hide suffering from Siddhartha's eyes, but they could not stop his mind from reaching toward it. The question his father had spent a lifetime trying to bury was now growing roots inside his own son's chest, fed not by misery, but by the very sensitivity that made Siddhartha who he was. And no tournament win, no loving wife, no flowering garden could pull those roots back out. The unease had taken hold. It would only grow from here. Part 5. The birth of Rahula. A son arrives, and the prince names him Fetter, sensing the hour of departure drawing near. Then came the news that should have filled any father's heart with pure, uncomplicated happiness. Yasodhara had given birth to a son, a healthy boy, an heir, the kind of moment that palace walls were made to celebrate. But when the word reached Siddhartha, he did not smile. He did not rush to hold the child or kiss his wife's forehead with relief. He sat quietly, and when asked what the boy should be named, he said one word, Rahula. It meant shackle. It meant chain. It meant the thing that holds you in place when every part of you wants to move. That name told the whole truth. Siddhartha loved Yasodhara. He loved this tiny new life. And that love was exactly what frightened him. Because somewhere beneath all that warmth, something else was pulling, something vast and nameless that he could not ignore. No matter how many flowers bloomed in the garden, or how many soft nights passed in the palace. The love made it harder, not easier. You cannot walk away from something you do not care about. It is only the things that matter that truly hold you. Suddhodana understood this, even if he could not admit it out loud. He had watched his son grow quieter, more inward, more restless. The palaces had done their job imperfectly. The feast was still on the table, but the guest was no longer hungry for it. So when Siddhartha began asking to go outside, to actually see the city of Kapilavastu, to walk among the people, to feel the air beyond the palace gates, Suddhodana agreed, but with conditions. He sent orders ahead. Clear the roads. Remove anything painful. Let the prince see only youth, health, and celebration. No sick people, no old people, no grief. For a while, it worked. A procession of freshly washed streets and smiling faces. a city that looked like a painting, arranged and tidied for one man's eyes. But roads cannot be swept clean forever. Cities breathe, people age, and Siddhartha was no longer the kind of man who would simply look and turn away. That field with the worms and the birds had already cracked something open in him. Rahula's birth had only made the pressure greater, the question louder. He now had the most beautiful reason in the world to stay, and somehow that made his need to go feel all the more urgent. The cage was still golden, but Siddhartha had begun to feel its shape, and the city outside those walls, carefully arranged as it was about to show him something his father had spent 29 years trying to hide. Chapter 2. The Great Departure. Into the Wilderness of Truth. Part 1. The Four Sights. One chariot ride changes everything. Old age, sickness, death, and the serenity of a wandering monk. Siddhartha had spent his entire life inside a world built on lies. Not cruel lies, but careful ones. His father had arranged everything so that the prince would never have to look at what life actually was. The roads were cleared, the sick were hidden, the old were kept out of sight. For years, it worked. Then came the chariot rides. On the first journey out of the palace, Siddhartha saw an old man. Not the dignified kind of old age his father may have described. This was a man bent so far forward, his face nearly touched his knees, skin hanging loose, legs shaking just to hold him upright. Siddhartha stared. He turned to his charioteer, a loyal man named Channa, and asked what had happened to this person. Channa answered plainly. Nothing happened to him, Prince. He simply got old. And this, Channa said quietly, is what waits for every single person alive, including you. That answer did not leave Siddhartha alone. On the second ride, he saw a man collapsed at the side of the road, body twisted and burning with sickness. Flies circled him. No one stopped. Again, Siddhartha asked. Again, Channa answered. This too is waiting for all of us. It is not bad luck. It is simply life. On the third ride, Siddhartha saw a dead body being carried to the cremation ground, mourners weeping and wailing behind it. He had never seen death before, not like this. He had never heard that specific sound of grief. He watched the smoke begin to rise in the distance, and sat in the chariot in complete silence. The man who had grown up believing the world was made of music and flowers and youth, was beginning to understand that it was not. 3 rides, 3 truths that could not be unseen. But it was the 4th ride that changed everything. On that day, moving through the same world now heavy with suffering, Siddhartha saw a wandering monk walking along the road. The man owned almost nothing. He was not rich. He was not young. He had no palace, no servants, no perfumed gardens, and yet his face was completely calm. Not the forced calm of someone pretending to be fine. Something real, something settled. He looked like a man who had found something the rest of the world was still searching for. Siddhartha could not stop looking at him. In 4 short journeys, the palace had lost its walls. The feasts, the dancers, the silks, the carefully arranged life his father had constructed with such love and such fear, none of it held anymore. Because now Siddhartha knew what was on the other side of those palace gates. And he also knew, for the first time, that someone had walked into that suffering and come out the other side, still standing, still breathing, still at peace. And Siddhartha was already walking toward it. Part 2. The Night of the Great Renunciation. Siddhartha cuts his hair, exchanges his robes, and rides into the darkness alone. That door Siddhartha had found, the one opened by the sight of a calm monk walking through a broken world, he was now about to step through it, permanently. And the night he chose to do it was quiet, full, and lit by a heavy moon. He did not storm out of the palace in anger. He did not argue, or announce, or explain himself. He walked, softly, one last time to the chamber where Yasodhara slept. She was there, curled beside their newborn son Rahula, both of them breathing in the gentle rhythm of deep sleep. Siddhartha stood in the doorway and looked. He did not speak. He did not touch them. Whatever he was feeling in that moment, love, grief, guilt, certainty, He held it all inside and let it sit there without a sound. Then he turned and walked away. This is the part of the story that makes people pause. He left a woman who loved him. He left a baby who had just arrived in the world. Some people have called it selfish. Others have called it the bravest thing a man has ever done. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and Siddhartha likely knew that too. He found his horseman, Channa, waiting with the white stallion Kantaka, and the three of them slipped out of Kapilavastu in silence. No torches, no ceremony, just hooves on dark ground and the sound of a life being left behind. The gates of the city fell away behind them, and with every step forward, the palace became less real. They rode until they reached the banks of the Anoma River. There, Siddhartha climbed down from Kantaka for the last time. He reached up, drew his sword, and in one clean stroke, cut off his long princely topknot, the knot that marked him as a man of royal birth, of noble blood, of a life already decided for him. It fell to the ground, like a small, silent resignation. He took off his silk robes. A hunter happened to be nearby, dressed in rough, simple cloth. Siddhartha traded with him, the fine fabric for the coarse, the prince for the seeker. He handed Channa his jewels, and everything else he carried that belonged to his old life. Then he sent them back. Channa and Kantaka turned toward the palace, and Siddhartha turned toward the forest. The old stories say Kantaka died on that return journey, that the horse's heart simply broke. Whether or not that is literally true, it tells you something about the weight of what had just happened. Something was over. Something new, unknown, and uncomfortable had begun. Siddhartha stood alone on the far bank, with nothing but rough cloth on his back, and a question he had carried since that first chariot ride. He had no plan, no guarantee, and no companion, just the river behind him and the dark forest ahead. Part 3. The Forest Masters, sitting at the feet of Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta, the limits of Brahmin wisdom revealed. He had stood at the river with nothing but rough cloth and a burning question. Now he needed someone who might have answers. So Siddhartha walked south. The kingdom of Magadha was known as a place where serious spiritual seekers gathered. It was not a comfortable land of palaces and feasts. It was a land of forests, fires, and men who had given up everything to understand life. Siddhartha fit right in. He was looking for the wisest teachers he could find, and the most respected name he kept hearing was Alara Kalama. Kalama was no ordinary teacher. He had spent years mastering the art of deep meditation, training his mind to go further and further inward, until the noise of the world completely disappeared. His most advanced students could reach a state he called the realm of nothingness, a place so deep and still inside the mind that nothing seemed to exist at all. It took most people years, sometimes decades, to get anywhere near it. Siddhartha reached it in a matter of weeks. Kalama was stunned. He had never seen anything like it. Here was this young man, barely settled into the forest camp, sitting down and moving through every level of practice as if he had done it 100 times before. When Siddhartha emerged from that deepest state, Kalama did something almost unheard of. He offered to share leadership of his entire community with him. 2 masters, equal in rank. It was the highest honor he could give. Siddhartha said no, not because he was ungrateful, not because the experience was fake. The realm of nothingness was real. It was peaceful, even beautiful in its own way. But when he came out of it, the world was still exactly the same. People were still old, still sick, still dying. His question had not been answered. The suffering had not been touched. It had simply been paused, like holding your breath underwater. The moment you surfaced, everything rushed back. So he moved on, this time to a teacher named Uddaka Ramaputta. Ramaputta claimed to teach something even deeper than Kalama, a state so subtle that the mind barely existed at all inside it. He called it the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. It sounds almost impossible to describe, and it was nearly impossible to reach. Siddhartha reached it anyway. Again an offer of leadership. Again a polite refusal. Again the same reason. The state was extraordinary, but it was still just a hiding place from suffering, not an answer to it. This was the painful truth both teachers had never fully confronted. They had found brilliant ways to escape suffering, to float above it for a while, inside the stillness of their own minds. But when the meditation ended, when the eyes opened, suffering was still sitting there. Neither Kalama nor Ramaputta could explain where it came from or how to truly end it. Siddhartha had now outgrown the two finest teachers of his age. He was still lost, but he was lost at a level no one else had even reached. That told him something important. The answer, whatever it was not going to come from someone else. He would have to find it himself. He walked deeper into the forest of Magadha, where 5 wandering ascetics were camped, and where a far more brutal chapter of his search was about to begin. Part 4. 5 Companions and the Years of Fire. Extreme Asceticism in the Forest of Uruvela. Starvation, Breath-Suppression, and the body at its breaking point. He walked into the forest of Uruvela carrying one conviction: the body was the enemy. The teachers had failed him. Meditation had brought him to extraordinary states of calm, but the suffering was still there underneath, like embers under ash. So now he would try something completely different. He would punish the body into submission. He would burn away every last desire, every last attachment, through sheer physical pain and denial. 5 men were already living this way in Uruvela. They were wandering ascetics, men who had left everything behind to torture themselves toward truth. When Siddhartha joined them, they recognized immediately that this was no ordinary seeker. He had the bearing of a prince and the eyes of someone who meant every bit of what he was doing. They welcomed him, and the 6 of them settled into a life that most people today would call madness. Siddhartha began cutting his food. First, smaller and smaller portions, then just a few grains. Eventually, he was living on a single grain of rice a day. Some accounts say a single sesame seed. The body that had once been fed in a palace, bathed, perfumed, wrapped in fine cloth, was now a rack of bones. His stomach caved inward until you could touch his spine through his abdomen. His eyes sank back into his skull. When people in nearby villages passed him on the road, some thought he was already dead. He also stopped breathing, not for a moment, for as long as he could force himself to hold it. He would clamp shut every passage, hold his breath until the pressure in his head built into something that felt like a blade, splitting his skull open from the inside. Ancient accounts say he heard roaring in his ears, saw lightning behind his eyes. He did it again and again. He sat in the blazing heat of midday when any sensible person had found shade. He stood through freezing nights without shelter. Whatever the body wanted, food, warmth, rest, air, Siddhartha refused it. The 5 companions watched all of this with growing awe. They were certain they were standing next to someone on the very edge of the greatest achievement a human being could reach. Every time Siddhartha pushed further than they thought possible, their admiration deepened. They waited for the moment he would break through, but he did not break through. He nearly broke completely, but not through. After months, then years of this, the suffering was not gone. The answers had not come. He was closer to death than to enlightenment, and some quiet part of him was beginning to register something important. He had now tried every serious path available to him. The masters, the deepest meditation, the most extreme physical denial. The great question was still sitting there, untouched. Something was going to have to change. And soon it would. Part 5. The Bowl of Rice Milk, Sujata's Offering, the Abandonment of Self-Mortification, and the Discovery of the Middle Way. Then came a woman with a bowl. Her name was Sujata, a village girl from a nearby settlement. She had made a vow to a tree deity, a spirit she believed lived in the great fig tree near the river. And now she had come to fulfill that promise. She carried a bowl of milk rice, thick and sweet and carefully prepared, meant as an offering to the god she imagined lived there. What she found instead was a man so thin, so hollowed out, that his ribs pushed through his skin like the bars of a cage. His eyes sat deep in his skull. His legs were like dry sticks. but there was something about him, a stillness, a presence, that made her certain she was looking at something beyond ordinary. She knelt and offered him the bowl. Siddhartha took it. He ate. It sounds so small, a man eating a bowl of food. But for someone who had spent years treating his body like an enemy to be punished, this was enormous. The warm, rich rice milk moved through him, and something loosened inside. Not just his body, something in his thinking. And then the memory came. He was a boy again. He was sitting under a rose apple tree during a plowing festival, watching the fields being turned. No one had told him to sit there. No teacher had assigned him an exercise. No discipline was being followed. He had simply sat, and without trying, without forcing, without denying himself anything, he had slipped into a state of complete, quiet joy. A stillness that was full rather than empty. A peace that came not from fighting the world, but from simply being present in it. He had been a child then, and had not known what it meant. Now, sitting with an empty bowl in his hands, he understood. Every path he had walked had been built on a kind of violence. Violence toward desire, toward the body, toward experience itself. But that afternoon under the rose apple tree, there had been no violence at all. Just clarity, just calm, just a mind that had settled naturally, like water going still. The answer was not in feasting, but it was not in starvation either. The truth lived somewhere between those two extremes, a middle road that did not swing to pleasure or punishment, but walked steadily between them. When his 5 companions saw him eat, they did not see an insight. They saw a failure. Here was the man they had followed and admired, putting food in his mouth like any ordinary person. They exchanged looks, shook their heads, and walked away. They left him there by the river, alone, dismissed, written off. Siddhartha watched them go. Then he walked to the river, washed himself clean for the first time in years, and felt the sun on his skin without grimacing at the comfort of it. Somewhere nearby stood a great pipal tree, wide and ancient, and rooted deep into the earth. He walked toward it, carrying nothing but the quiet certainty that he was finally walking in the right direction. Whatever was going to happen next would happen there. Chapter 3. The Night Beneath the Tree. War with Mara and the Dawn of Awakening. Part 1. The Seat That Cannot Be Abandoned. Siddhartha spreads the kusa grass, vows not to rise until he is awakened or dead. He had walked for weeks, eaten almost nothing, and sat beneath dozens of trees, searching for something that kept slipping away. But now, as he approached the great pipal tree near a small town that would one day be called Bodh Gaya, something felt different. The searching was over. What remained was the sitting. A man named Sathya was passing by, carrying a bundle of fresh kusa grass, the kind used for simple bedding. He offered some to Siddhartha. It was a small, quiet moment, the kind that gets forgotten a minute later. Sathya likely had no idea what he had just handed to history. Siddhartha took the grass, walked to the base of the great tree, and spread it on the ground in a neat, careful layer. He sat down, crossed his legs, and turned to face east, the direction of the rising sun. Then he made his vow. He would not get up, not for hunger, not for fear, not for doubt. He would sit until he had found what he was looking for, full, complete, total awakening, or until his body fell apart trying. There was no room left for maybe, no back door. Every path that led away from this seat had been closed. Think about what that means for a moment. This was a man who had already left his palace, his wife, his child, his name. He had starved himself until his spine could be felt through his stomach. He had studied under the greatest teachers of his time and found them lacking. He had tried everything the world offered as an answer, and none of it had held. Now he was placing his very life on the line for a truth he had not yet touched, but somehow could not stop moving toward. The grass beneath him was soft. The tree above him was wide and old. The evening air was still, and Siddhartha closed his eyes. What happened next in the long, dark hours that followed would not just change his life, it would become the beating heart of a tradition followed by hundreds of millions of people across thousands of years. Every monastery, every meditation hall, every shaved head and saffron robe traces its line back to this single, silent, absolute moment. A tired man sitting on a patch of grass, refusing to move until he understood why we suffer and how we can stop. Everything before this night had been the preparation. A prince learning the world was broken. A student learning the answers weren't enough. A wanderer learning that pain alone was not wisdom. All of it had been building, quietly and steadily, toward this seat beneath this tree on this night. And the night was only just beginning. Part 2. The Army of Mara, the Lord of Illusion, launches 3 assaults. Fear, desire, and doubt. The earth itself bears witness. That night beneath the tree was not peaceful. It was a war. As Siddhartha sat still, eyes closed, breath steady, something stirred. The tradition calls it Mara, not a monster with claws and fangs, but something far more familiar. Mara was everything inside a person that says, not yet, not you, not this. He was craving. He was fear. He was the voice that whispers, you are not good enough, that pulls you back to bed when you should rise, that makes you reach for comfort when truth is within reach. And on this night, he came with everything he had. The first wave was noise. Mara sent his armies, not soldiers with swords, but something worse. Storms of fear rolled in like dark clouds. Doubt crept in like cold fog. Boredom, restlessness, and the creeping sense that this was all pointless came crashing down like rain. Every meditator who has ever sat in silence knows these visitors. They come uninvited. They are loud. They insist you pay attention to them. For most people, they win. But Siddhartha sat still. The arrows passed through him like wind through an open window. He did not fight. He did not flinch. He simply did not move. Mara tried again, this time softer. He sent his 3 daughters, Tanha, Arati, and Raga. Their names mean craving, aversion, and passion. They came not with threats, but with beauty, with temptation, with the silent promise that pleasure was better than truth. They danced. They offered warmth. They offered everything the world had taught Siddhartha to want. He looked at them the way you look at clouds passing across the sky. He saw them clearly, and he let them pass. There was nothing in him left to grab onto. Then Mara made his boldest move. He questioned the very ground Siddhartha sat on. Who are you to sit here? What gives you the right? What have you done to earn this seat? It was not a sword. It was something more cutting, doubt dressed as reason, pride dressed as justice. Siddhartha did not answer with words. He reached down and touched the earth. Just that. One hand lowered gently, fingers pressing into the soil. And the earth answered. It roared, not to prove anything, not to argue, but to witness, to confirm what countless lifetimes of generosity, patience, and sacrifice had quietly built. The ground beneath him had seen it all, every good deed across 10,000 lives, every moment of kindness that had gone unnoticed and unrewarded. That accumulated goodness was real. It was recorded not in books, but in the very fabric of existence. Mara's armies had nowhere left to stand. They scattered. The war was over. The real work could now begin. Part 3. The 3 Watches of the Night. Past lives illuminate the sky. Dependent origination unravels before his eyes. The cankers of the mind collapse. The silence that fell after Mara's armies scattered was not an empty silence. It was the silence of a battlefield after the last soldier has run. Siddhartha sat beneath the tree, completely still, and the real work began. Not a fight this time, but a seeing. The night was divided, as it was in those times, into 3 watches. 3 segments of darkness, each one holding something the next would build upon. In the first watch, something extraordinary happened. Siddhartha's mind, now utterly calm and focused, began to see backward. Not like remembering a dream or recalling childhood, this was different. Life after life after life opened up before him, clear as daylight. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. He saw who he had been, what he had done, who he had loved and harmed and helped. He saw the same patterns repeating: greed leading to suffering, generosity leading to peace, like a thread stitched through every single one of those lives. This was not guesswork. He was watching it the way you watch fire burn. Karma, the law of cause and effect, was not a theory anymore. It was a memory. By the second watch, his vision had expanded beyond himself. Now he could see all beings, not just his own past, but the great turning wheel of existence itself. Beings dying and being reborn, rising and falling, not randomly, but according to what they had done and chosen and clung to. He saw the mechanism clearly, the chain that keeps beings trapped. One thing leads to another, always. Ignorance feeds desire, desire feeds grasping, grasping feeds suffering. This was dependent origination, the understanding that nothing arises by accident and nothing suffers without a cause. To see it was to see the entire structure of the trap that holds every living being. Then came the third watch, just before dawn, the darkest and quietest hour. Siddhartha turned this same clear, unflinching awareness inward, not outward at other beings or backward at past lives, but directly at his own mind. And there, in that final examination, he found the last roots of bondage, still sitting quietly inside him. 3 of them: the craving for pleasure, the craving to keep existing, and beneath both of them, ignorance, the oldest root of all, the one that had fed everything else for countless lifetimes. He looked at them the way you look at a fire you are about to put out, and they went out. There was no explosion, no blinding light, just an extinction. The word the tradition uses is nirvana, and it literally means a flame being extinguished. The chain broke, not one link of it, but all of it, from the very first. The thing that had been pulling Siddhartha back into life after life after life, the machinery of becoming, simply stopped. Dawn was approaching now. The darkest part of the night had passed. Something that had been Siddhartha Gautama, prince, wanderer, ascetic, seeker, was no longer quite that person anymore. Something had ended, and something else was just about to be named. Part 4. At dawn, the moment nirvana arrives, I have found the ancient path. The Tathagata, the thus gone one, is born. And then it was over. Not with a crash, not with a shout, just still. As the morning star pushed its light over the horizon, something settled into place inside the man sitting beneath that great tree. The fire went out, not because it was put out, but because there was nothing left to burn. That is exactly how he would later describe it. Nirvana, a flame extinguished. The man who had been Siddhartha Gautama, the pampered prince who had sneaked out of his palace, the wanderer who had begged for food, the ascetic who had nearly starved himself to bones, that man was gone. Not dead, just completely, utterly transformed. What remained, sitting cross-legged in the early morning light, was something the tradition would call the Tathagata. It is a strange and beautiful word. It means, roughly, the one who has thus come, and the one who has thus gone. A being who passed all the way through the constructed world, through all the wanting and fearing and grasping, and came out the other side. What had actually happened inside him? He had seen it all clearly. Suffering exists. Craving causes it. Craving can stop. There is a path that leads to that stopping. These were not new religious ideas he had invented. He described them as an ancient path, an old road that previous Buddhas had walked in ages long forgotten. He had not built this road. He had found it again, buried under centuries of dust, and cleared it with his own mind. He had not just thought these things, he had known them the way you know fire is hot, directly in the bone. There was no more doubt left anywhere in him. The machinery that had been dragging him from life to life, the deep hunger that made beings cling and grasp and be reborn, had simply stopped working. The chain was broken. Every single link. The tree above him, the great pipal tree whose leaves must have rustled quietly in the pre-dawn air, would forever after be called the Bodhi tree. the Tree of Awakening, and the place itself, that quiet patch of ground in northern India, would become one of the most sacred spots on earth. He sat there as the sky brightened. The world around him looked the same dust, the same birds, the same distant sounds of a world slowly waking up. But the man who sat in it was not the same. The seeker was gone, the Buddha had arrived. What would he do now? That question, heavy and strange, would hang in the air for weeks, because discovering the truth and sharing it are very different things. And the Buddha was about to discover just how difficult the second part would be. Part 5. The 7 Weeks Beneath the Trees. Brahma Sahampati descends, pleads with the Buddha to teach. A silence ends. He stayed. For 7 weeks, the Buddha did not go far. He moved slowly between different spots near the Bodhi tree, sitting, breathing, existing in a kind of peace that no human language had ever quite managed to describe. He was not sleeping. He was not thinking through problems. He was simply resting in what he had found, a complete freedom from craving, from fear, from the endless noise of wanting. For the first time in countless lifetimes, there was nothing left to chase. But as those weeks passed, a question began to form. Not an anxious question, not the kind that used to keep Siddhartha awake in the palace, or hollow-cheeked in the forest. This was quieter than that. What now? He thought about what he had seen during those 3 watches of the night. The truth he had found was not simple. It was not the kind of thing you could carve onto a wall or sing as a song. It ran against everything people naturally believed. People wanted pleasure to last. The truth said nothing lasts. People wanted a permanent self, a soul that would go on forever. The truth said there is no such fixed thing. People ran toward comfort and away from pain. The truth said that very running was the problem. How do you explain that to someone standing knee-deep in their own desires, convinced that one more thing, one more achievement, one more relationship, one more experience will finally make them feel whole? The Buddha looked at the world and felt something close to despair. Not his own despair, he was past that, but a deep, clear-eyed recognition of how tangled human minds tend to be, how attached people are to their dust. He wondered if anyone would even be able to hear what he had to say. He stayed quiet. Then something shifted. The old texts describe it this way. A god named Brahma Sahampati appeared before him. Brahma, in the ancient Indian understanding, was not a small figure. He was considered one of the highest beings in existence. And yet here he was, hands pressed together, bowing before a man sitting beneath a tree. He pleaded. He said that there were people out there, not everyone, but some, who had only a little dust in their eyes. Just a little. And those people, if they heard the truth, would understand it. He begged the Buddha not to let it die in silence. Whether you read this as a literal divine visit or as a metaphor for the compassion stirring inside the Buddha himself, the meaning is the same. Something answered the hesitation. The Buddha looked out at a world full of people struggling, suffering, chasing things that could never truly satisfy them, and he felt it land in his chest. Karuna, compassion, not pity, but something warmer and more active than that. A genuine wish for all of them to find what he had found. He turned his face northwest, toward the ancient city of Varanasi, toward a deer park called Isipatana, where 5 men who had once walked with him were living. Those 5 had abandoned him when he gave up the extreme fasting. They thought he had failed. They did not know what had happened beneath that tree. The Buddha began to walk toward them. The silence was over. Chapter 4. The wheel is set in motion. A new path for humanity. Part 1. The deer park at Isipatana. Reunion with the 5 former companions, and the first sermon, the 4 noble truths, and the Eightfold path proclaimed. He had spent weeks walking. The roads from Bodh Gaya to Varanasi were long and dusty, but Siddhartha, now the Buddha, the awakened one, walked with a calm that surprised even those who passed him along the way. He had something to share, something he believed could change everything for anyone willing to listen. He knew exactly who he wanted to find first. At the deer park of Isipatana, just outside Varanasi, 5 men sat under the trees. These were the same 5 ascetics who had once followed Siddhartha faithfully, watching him starve himself and push his body to its absolute limits. But when he had accepted a bowl of rice from a young woman named Sujata, they had walked away in disgust. To them he had given up. He had gone soft. He was a failure. So when they saw him approaching across the park, they made a quiet agreement among themselves. They would not stand to greet him. They would not show him any respect. He had broken the rules of their path, and they wanted nothing to do with him. But something strange happened as he got closer. One by one, without quite knowing why, they stood up. They took his robe. They offered him water. They called him by his name, ready to speak to him as an equal. Later, no one could fully explain it. There was just something about him, something in the way he carried himself, something in his eyes, something quiet and unshakable that made it impossible to treat him as ordinary. He sat with them and said simply that he had found something. Not a god, not a miracle, just the truth about why life hurts and what a person can actually do about it. What he taught them that evening would later be called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which roughly means the turning of the wheel of truth. It was the first time the Buddha taught, and those who came after him would consider it the most important sermon ever spoken. He began with something he called the 4 Noble Truths. First, suffering is real. Life brings pain, loss, disappointment, and death. No one escapes this. Second, the reason we suffer is craving. We want things to stay when they cannot. We chase pleasures that fade. We run from discomfort that returns. Third, this craving can actually stop. The suffering is not permanent. There is a way out. Fourth, the way out is a path, and he described it clearly. That path had 8 parts: right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right way of living, right effort, right awareness, and right focus of the mind. Not 8 separate tasks, but 8 qualities to develop together, like fingers on the same hand. He also told them what he had learned in his own life. Starving yourself does not free the mind. Overindulging yourself does not free the mind. The answer is the middle. A life lived with care, honesty, and awareness, not too tight, not too loose. As he spoke, one of the 5 men, an older ascetic named Kondana, felt something shift inside him. It was as if a door he had never noticed before suddenly opened. He understood, not just with his head, but deep in his bones. He saw clearly, perhaps for the first time, how things truly were. The Buddha looked at him and smiled. "Kondana knows," he said quietly. That moment mattered more than it might seem. Kondana became the first person to understand the teaching and take the first step toward awakening. The Buddha was no longer alone in what he knew. There was now a teacher and a student, a flame and someone to carry it forward. Over the days that followed, all 5 men listened, asked questions, and one by one, they understood. They became the first monks. A community had been born, what would later be called the Sangha. 3 things now existed together: the Buddha, the teaching, and the community. These 3 would become the heart of everything that followed. Only inside one man's mind was now in the world, and the world would never quite be the same again. Part 2. The Sangha takes root. Kings, merchants, Brahmins, and outcasts join the community. Anathapindika builds Jetavana Monastery. From those first 5 monks in the deer park, something extraordinary began to happen. Word traveled fast. In a world without newspapers or phones, news still moved, carried by travelers, merchants, and wandering teachers walking dusty roads between towns. And the news was this: there was a man who had found the answer to suffering, and he was willing to teach it to anyone who would listen. One of the first powerful people to take notice was King Bimbisara, the ruler of Magadha, one of the strongest kingdoms in all of northern India. This was a man who commanded armies and collected taxes from thousands of people. Yet when he sat before the Buddha and listened, something shifted inside him. He did not convert in the way we might think today. he did not abandon his throne or his responsibilities. Instead, he became a supporter, a protector. He donated a beautiful bamboo grove called Veluvana near his capital city of Rajagriha, so that the growing group of monks would have a quiet, shaded place to live, rest, and practice. A king had bowed his head to a former prince who now owned nothing but a robe and a bowl. Then came Anathapindika. He was a merchant, fabulously wealthy, known for his generosity to the poor. When he heard the Buddha teach, he was so moved that he wanted to give something truly special. He found a grove of trees near the city of Savatthi, owned by a prince named Jeta, and asked to buy it. The prince, perhaps thinking the price would scare the merchant away, said the merchant could have it only if he could cover every inch of the ground with gold coins. Anathapindika did exactly that. He sent cart after cart of gold and laid the coins across the earth until the whole grove glittered. On that land he built Jetavana Monastery, a real permanent home for the Buddha and his monks. The Buddha would spend 19 rainy seasons there, more than at any other place in his life. A merchant's impossible act of generosity had given the teaching a home. But it was not just kings and rich men who came. 2 young men named Sariputta and Maudgalana heard just 2 sentences. 2 lines of teaching passed along secondhand, and felt something click into place inside them. They joined immediately, and over time they became the Buddha's 2 greatest students, the ones who helped carry the teaching to others with a clarity and depth that matched the teacher himself. What made this community truly remarkable, though, was something that must have seemed almost scandalous at the time. India in those days was deeply divided by caste. A Brahmin, born into the priestly class, would not eat beside a servant or an outcast. Social rank was everything. But inside the Sangha, none of that mattered. Priests and warriors sat beside merchants. Merchants sat beside people who had been treated as the lowest of the low their entire lives. They all shared the same shade, heard the same words, and walked the same path. The world outside the grove had its rules. Inside, there was only one question: are you willing to look honestly at your own suffering and do the work? This was not just a spiritual movement anymore. It was becoming something that touched the fabric of society itself. And with kings offering their forests, merchants covering the earth in gold, and outcasts finding a seat at the same table as priests, it was clear this was no longer just one man's insight. It had become a living community, growing, spreading, taking root in the soil of the world. What would come next was a journey that would last 45 more years, cover thousands of miles of dusty roads, and reach into every corner of the world the Buddha walked. Part 3. Return to Kapilavastu. The Buddha walks home. Yasodhara's grief, Rahula's ordination, and King Suddhodana's reluctant surrender. Several years had passed since Siddhartha left Kapilavastu as a restless young prince searching for answers. Now he was coming back, but not the way anyone expected. King Suddhodana had sent messengers asking his son to return home. The old king missed him. Perhaps he also hoped that seeing the palace, the family, the life he had left behind, might soften something in Siddhartha. But when the Buddha finally arrived at the gates of Kapilavastu, he did not walk to the palace. He walked through the streets of the city with a simple begging bowl in his hands, just like any ordinary monk. The people of the city stopped and stared. This was their prince. The man who was supposed to sit on a throne was now standing at strangers' doors, asking for food. Suddhodana was humiliated. He rushed to his son and asked him to stop. "A king's son does not beg," he said. It was embarrassing. It was wrong. The Buddha looked at his father calmly and said something the old king had never heard before. He explained that this was the way of all Buddhas. Every awakened one walks this path. It had nothing to do with shame. It was about living simply, staying humble, depending on no one's power or wealth. Suddhodana did not fully understand, but something in his son's voice made him go quiet. Then came Yasodhara. She had spent years raising their son alone, wondering if her husband would ever return. She had heard the stories, that he had become something extraordinary, that thousands followed him, that kings offered him forests and merchants paved the ground with gold for him. And yet she had never remarried, never stopped waiting. When the Buddha came to her, she did not go to him first. She waited. She made him come to her. And when he walked through her door, she fell at his feet and wept. There are no records of exactly what was said between them, but the weeping said everything. Then came the moment that would change the family forever. Their son Rahula, now a young boy, walked up to his father. He had been told he could ask his father for his inheritance, the things a son is owed. So he did. He asked for what was his. The Buddha looked at the boy and made a choice. He could give Rahula gold, land, a kingdom. Instead, he asked his disciple Sariputta to ordain the boy as a novice monk. He gave Rahula the Dhamma, the teachings, and said this was a far greater inheritance than any throne. Suddhodana was heartbroken. First he had lost his son. Now his grandson was also being taken. He went to the Buddha and made one quiet request, that no child ever be ordained as a monk without the consent of their parents. He could not bear another family breaking apart the same way his had. The Buddha listened, and he agreed. That rule was added to the code of the community and remains part of it to this day. What happened in Kapilavastu was not a triumphant homecoming. There were no celebrations, no fanfare, no golden welcome. It was something quieter and more painful. A father watching his son live by rules he didn't fully understand. A wife weeping at the feet of the man she had loved and lost. And a little boy walking away from a kingdom to become a monk. But it also showed something important about who the Buddha was. He did not make exceptions, even for his own family. And yet he was not cold. He came to Yasodhara. He listened to his father. He honored the grief around him, even while staying true to the path. The Buddha's return to Kapilavastu was not the end of anything. It was just one stop on a journey that had barely begun. Ahead of him lay 45 more years of walking, teaching, and shaping a world that would never quite be the same again. Part 4. 45 Years on the Road. The Great Itinerary. Monsoon retreats, rival teachers, Devadatta's betrayal, and a revolution spreading across the Gangetic Plain. Those 45 years were not a quiet retirement. They were a relentless, tireless march across one of the most alive and restless regions of the ancient world. From the moment he left Kapilavastu after his homecoming, the Buddha was always moving, always teaching, always meeting the next person who needed to hear something that might change their life. The rhythm of his days became predictable in the best possible way. For 9 months of the year, he walked, village to village, city to city, forest path to dusty road. He slept in groves and monasteries, ate whatever was placed in his bowl, and talked to everyone, kings who received him in grand halls, widows who stopped him on the roadside, confused young men who had left home looking for answers. He never gave the same talk twice, not exactly. He had a gift for reading people. A farmer got a teaching about soil and seeds. A grieving mother got something else entirely. He met every person where they were. When the monsoon rains came, travel became nearly impossible. Roads turned to mud, rivers flooded. And so every year, for 3 months, the Buddha and his monks would settle in one place. Most often the Jetavana monastery near Shravasti, the magnificent park that the merchant Anathapindika had paid for quite literally in gold. These rainy retreats became a sacred pause, a time for deeper teaching, reflection, and community. Monks would gather, questions would be asked, the Dhamma would deepen. But not everything about those decades was peaceful. The Buddha was not the only spiritual teacher walking those roads. Mahavira, a leader of the Jains, was his near-exact contemporary, teaching a very different path just miles away in the same towns and kingdoms. There was no great war between them, but there was competition, debate, and a constant tug-of-war over followers, patronage, and philosophical ground. The two movements eyed each other, challenged each other, and in doing so, sharpened each other. The more painful challenge came from much closer. His own cousin, Devadatta, had joined the community and risen to become a respected monk. But somewhere along the way, ambition crept in. Devadatta decided he should lead the Sangha. He pushed for stricter rules, harsher austerities, more rigid discipline, and when the Buddha refused, Devadatta broke away and took a group of monks with him. It was a betrayal that cut deep into the community. But it did not stop there. Ancient texts claim Devadatta went further, allegedly arranging for hired killers to be sent after the Buddha, rolling a boulder toward him on a hillside, and even releasing a rogue, enraged elephant named Nalagiri directly into the Buddha's path. The killers became his disciples. The boulder only grazed him, and Nalagiri, by most accounts, simply stopped in front of the Buddha and knelt. Whether taken literally or as legend, the stories all point to the same truth. The man was unshakable. Decade by decade, the movement spread. Magadha, Kosala, Vaishali, the great kingdoms and republics of the Gangetic Plain all felt the reach of what had started under a single tree in Bodh Gaya. Kings became patrons, wealthy merchants built monasteries. Ordinary people, low caste and high, found something in this teaching that older systems had never offered them, a path that said their worth had nothing to do with the family they were born into. By the time the Buddha was an old man, he had walked thousands of miles and spoken to tens of thousands of people. The world around him was not the same world he had left when he first sat down under that tree. And he was not done yet. There was still one more journey to make. Part 5. The Final Rains and Parinirvana at Kushinagar. The last meal, the last teaching, the last breath, and the silence that became a world religion. That last journey began quietly. No grand announcement, no royal procession, just an old man, 80 years old, walking north through the dust and heat of northeastern India, leaning perhaps a little more heavily on the path beneath his feet than he once had. He told Ananda, his closest attendant, the one who had walked beside him for decades, that the end was near. Ananda wept. The Buddha, as he always did, simply kept moving. Before he got far, he stopped to eat at the home of a blacksmith named Kunda. The meal, likely mushrooms or pork, the texts are not entirely clear, made him violently ill. What matters more than what was in the bowl is what the Buddha said afterward. He told his followers to make sure no one ever blamed Kunda. The man had offered food with a good heart, and that, the Buddha said, was enough. Even at the end, his concern was for the person who might carry guilt, not for himself. He kept walking. He stopped to teach along the way because that was simply who he was. People asked questions and he answered them. He was sick, exhausted, and 80 years old, and he still could not pass a person with a question without stopping to help them understand. That had been his life for 45 years, and he saw no reason to change it now. When he finally reached Kushinagar, people who did not know the history might have wondered why this place. It was not a great city. It was not Varanasi where he had given his first sermon. It was not Rajagriha where kings had sat at his feet. It was a small, quiet town, almost easy to overlook on a map. But he chose it, and he lay down in a grove of sal trees belonging to the Malla clan, arranging himself on his right side in what is called the lion's posture, calm, still, composed. The people who had gathered around him were crying. He looked at them and gave them the last words he would ever speak. They were simple words, almost plain. He said that all things that are built must eventually fall apart, and that the only answer to that truth is to keep working, keep practicing, keep moving forward with everything you have. Then he closed his eyes, moved through layer after layer of deep meditation, and was gone. The sal trees above him, the old stories say, bloomed out of season. It was as if the world itself did not know what else to do. What happened next is something no one in that grove could have predicted. A man had lived, walked, taught, and died. And in that silence that followed his last breath, something larger than any one life began to take its shape. Within centuries, millions of people across Asia would follow the path he had described under those trees. Within 2,500 years, it would reach every corner of the world. All of it started with a prince who walked away from a palace, sat down under a tree, and refused to move until he understood what suffering was and how it could end. He had found the answer. He had spent his entire life giving it away. And the silence that filled that grove in Kushinagar was not an ending. It was the moment the whole thing truly began.